Hi, I'm Justin Clarke. I'm the Menard Family Professor of Philosophy and Ethics here at Ottawa University, and I'm a member of the Guartney Institute. And I'd like to welcome you to our first Urbit Meetup. Today you're going to hear from me, and you're also going to hear from Josh Lehman, who is the director of the Urbit Foundation, which is the main foundation which is charged with developing Urbit in the future. I'll talk a little bit about some of the problems that I think our current online environment fosters, and Josh will pick up that talk and he will explain what Urbit is, a little bit about its history, and how Urbit is poised to try and solve those problems moving into the future. I hope you enjoy it.
So let me welcome all of you to the first of our 3 meetings on Urbit, which is a very interesting decentralized software project. I'm going to talk today for about 15 minutes. I'm Justin Clarke. I'm a philosophy professor. I'm a Menard Family Professor of Philosophy and Ethics here at Ottawa University. This event is being put on by the Guartney Institute. And so with me we have Dr. Russ McCullough, who is the founder of the Guartney Institute, and Dr. Peter Jacobson, who is the professor of economic research at the Guartney Institute. And we all think Urbit is a really interesting and cool idea, so we're going to try to explain it. So the way this is going to go, I'll talk for about 10-15 minutes and give you a kind of high-level overview of why I think Urbit is interesting and the problems that I think Urbit is well-equipped to solve, or at least to address. And then we're going to let Josh come in, and since Josh is the director of the Urbit Foundation, and actually works with Urbit and on Urbit and directs Urbit's growth, he's going to tell you all of the reasons why what I said might have been wrong or misplaced, and he's going to correct me and help tell you about what Urbit really is. So,
and you ready to screen share?
yeah. So when we talk about Urbit, I'm going to focus on identity, ownership, and incentives. And so to start this off, in 2018, Tyler Cohen, who's a very famous economist and public intellectual, he wrote this article in Bloomberg, which was titled, "Americans Own Less Stuff, and That's Reason to Be Nervous." And the title of this slide, as you can see, is "Hello, it's 2021 and you don't own things anymore." So Cohen's article concerned the growth of things like Uber and Netflix and Spotify, and he was really worried that as subscriptions to services and this kind of mode of our economy increases, Americans get less used to owning things. And he also thought, well, it's actually a very important component of American culture that we are a culture of ownership. Because Cohen thinks that when you own things, you are more liable to take care of them. And so he's really worried that as we move away from this culture of ownership, that might erode certain bedrock principles in our economy and have a deleterious effect going forward. But it's not just things like Netflix, Spotify, and Kindle. Data is rapidly replacing physical structures. And the business model of software subscription and service subscriptions are replacing business models where you actually own things. And the World Economic Foundation recently, right after the start of the pandemic, they put out this tweet which was widely and I think judiciously mocked, saying, in the year 2030, everyone will be happy, you'll be happier, and you won't own anything. So in 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. So this trajectory is to this world where you actually don't own anything and you're going to be happier about it. Now again, if the World Economic Foundation is right, Cohen is wrong, right? So these are two competing visions of the future. One where you own nothing and you're happy, and another where the loss of ownership is a problem. So, well, let's take a step back and look at how we currently communicate with each other. And according to common lore, like what it feels like you're doing when you use your computer to communicate with people, we use our computers to store our personal data, and then we connect our computers to the internet. And then we communicate with each other, sending our data to our friends, who then send their data back to us, and so on. And this actually kind of sounds good. It sounds plausible. It sounds a little bit like a digital version of the way you and I interact in real life. Right? We pass things back and forth, and I come up with thoughts in my brain, and then I tell them to you with my mouth. They go in through your ears, etc. So the only problem with this version of, and this view of how we actually communicate with each other is that it is wildly incorrect. And that is actually not the way we communicate with each other online. So here's how it really works. We use our computers like very agile modems. We connect our devices, what we would call our computers, right? Our phones and our laptops. We actually connect those to distant computers. We connect them to servers that are owned and maintained by very large corporations. So when I send you a direct message or some other information on Facebook or Twitter, I'm really using my computer to connect to some megacorp server. And I send them the information. And then, and this is if and only if they deign to, they think it's okay, then they pass that information back on to you. And this is how all our communication goes back and forth. There is this middleman. And what this really means is that these corporations have control of our data. And so they have control of all the communication between us. Now, you might not think this is a huge problem with your direct messaging or whatever, but the world is increasingly data. The things that you care about are increasingly data. Your entertainment is increasingly data. I have a shelf full of DVDs that haven't been opened since I moved houses because the way you watch movies is you connect your TV to a distant server and they pipe you the entertainment that you want. But it's not just things like entertainment. Your money is increasingly data. The amount of money that you have in your bank account is data that sits on the server in your bank, right? Your social groups are increasingly data. The way you manage your social groups is you kind of deal with them on Facebook or however it is the kids today deal with them, right? But either way, you don't have a Rolodex in your kitchen full of numbers. Your memories. I remember going into a panic with my wife because we couldn't find our wedding photos because we had stored them on the cloud and didn't know where they were. One of the theses in philosophy of mind that has been popular lately is called the extended mind, which is this idea that you used to have all this information in your actual mind about like where things were and how to get to Quick Stop or wherever it is that you're going. And now, since tablets and phones have become so powerful, we actually kind of offload that mental work that we used to do onto our devices, right? Now, the only problem with that, and so this thesis says, well, actually, your mind isn't actually just contained in your skull anymore. Since you're offloading all this mental work to your devices, your mind actually consists of some of the work that those devices are doing. And that might seem weird anyway, but it's even weirder if the part of you that you are offloading to another device actually isn't anything you own anymore. It can be taken from you at any moment if one of these services decides to no longer serve you the data that you request or allows you to access the data that you thought was yours. So it's not just memories, it's not just money, entertainment, or social groups. Increasingly, a lot of what people think of as their actual personal identity is something that lives on the cloud. If you are interacting with your social group, then what you consider your own personal identity might be the identity that you have set up for any particular service. Okay. So with all that in place, it's important to remember that incentives matter. And so if somebody else controls all the data that you want to access, you shouldn't be surprised when they make you pay to access that data. And you might think, well, a lot of these services are free, but they're not free, right? So you pay with your attention, and a lot of times this is ads that these companies are serving you, right? And if someone else is delivering your communication, you shouldn't be surprised that they monitor those communications. Gmail is reading all of your email. That doesn't mean that there's actually somebody at Gmail reading them, but the service Gmail is accessing the content of all of your communications in your email. And you shouldn't be surprised that that's happening if it's a service that's being given to you for free, and they are the ones delivering your messages. And finally, if a firm's business model is ad-based, you shouldn't be surprised when that firm weaponizes information you gave it about yourself in order to maximize the amount of time you spend watching advertisements. So it's in their best interest to use the information about you that they can get from monitoring your communications in order to serve you ads for things that they think you might want to buy. And it's also in their interest to engineer their product such that you spend more time in front of their software so that you can see more ads. This is done better or worse, right? I bought a leaf blower last year, and then I got served a ton of ads. And do you know what they were for? Leaf blowers. They should. That's just dumb, right? Nobody walks around with 2 leaf blowers. It's and you can see this. You can see your ads change based on your purchasing. And that's just a great example of the ways that these firms are mining your data to try to weaponize your time really against you. So in addition to incentives mattering, identity matters. We depend on our personal identity in the real life, in meat space, and we depend on the identities of our friends, families, and teammates and coworkers. Things like families, marriages, jobs, loans. These are all social functions or institutions that individuals participate in, but these are institutions that work and only work when they work, partly because they are parasitic on our permanent, persistent, and owned identities. They depend on things like character and reputation, that is, your personal identity through time. You want to count on somebody being the same person throughout time, and that you can count on somebody being the person that they appear to be. So persistent owned identities structure incentives in a way that make these worthwhile institutions not only possible, but thrive. It would be really hard for a practice like lending money or employment or marriage to even come about in the first place if there weren't such a thing as persistent owned identity. You can imagine a world where this isn't the case, right? So there's a book called A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick, and in this book, people put on what are called scatter suits, and it just changes the way you are, the way your identity looks by the second, to where you can't really tell who is under the scatter suit, right? There's actually a movie based on the book too. Keanu Reeves in it. But one of the things that's interesting about the scatter suit idea is you can try to imagine what marriage would look like in a world where everyone has scatter suits widely available. What would a bank loan look like if you couldn't figure out who was actually under the scatter suit? So the idea isn't that scatter suits are bad or whatever, but it's this idea that these institutions that we really value, they seem to depend on having identity as something that we can count on. And if that's the case, then we need to look at how our current digital practices incentivize us to behave. So we can look at things and behavior that we consider virtuous. We can look at the 4 classical virtues, the virtues of justice, prudence, temperance, and courage. We want to structure our society in a way that fosters these virtues. It's one of the things that we would look to do when we start a society from scratch. If you don't like one of these virtues, substitute whichever one you like, right? And you might ask, well, does the way we currently structure society in real life reflect the respect of these virtues? You might think, well, yeah, things like jobs and marriages and bank loans, they depend, and they reward things like justice, prudence, temperance, and courage. But if you look at the way our online lives are structured, I'm not sure that they do, that our online world does reward things like justice, prudence, temperance, and courage. Take courage, for example, right? Courage is supposed to be this mean virtue between foolhardiness, which is, supreme over self-confidence, and cowardliness. So if you have courage, you're supposed to stand up for the things that you believe in when it's prudent to stand up for them, right? Does that seem like the kind of practice that your online world rewards today? It seems like in a world where identities are free, and anyone can spin up as many identities as they want to attack you for standing up for something, or it seems like the virtue of courage isn't rewarded in the online space the way we have it set up. And so the question is, do we have to live this way? Do we have to compute this way? Does our online world have to be structured this way? And Urbit's answer is no, it doesn't. We can design a different internet. We can design a way to compute that is different than this. And if this is the case, if it is the case that the way things are structured now does not reward our virtues, you might think, well, what kind of, is there an opportunity cost to this? What kind of social institutions, firms, and communities are we missing out on because of misaligned incentives? So in a world where every bank or every large software subscription service has to run their own identity management program, that's a large amount of bloat that any firm has to devote to solving a problem that you don't really need to solve in mean space, right? So let's look at what Urbit promises. Urbit promises a version of computing where you own your own computer, you own your own data, and you own your own identity, and nobody can take these things away from you. No one can kick you off the network, and no one can bring, and you can bring your data and your identity with you wherever you roam. So you don't have to create a new identity when you start a new service. Your identity is fixed to you. It is something that you can build over time. It's something that you can actually hand it down through generations if you want. This is a world where you can communicate directly with your peers in an end-to-end encrypted manner. So just like in the real world where I'm talking to you, there's no third party. In fact, since it's end-to-end encrypted, if a third party even got a hold of the communications, it would look like gibberish to them. So this is back to a world where you can actually be, sure that the only person reading your information is the person that you're sending it to. And that goes not just for direct messages, that goes for group chats, that kind of thing. So this is a world where your software serves you and isn't continually trying to trick you into serving it, which I take it is the world that we live in right now, where your software is trying to get you to spend some more time with your software. All right, so that's it for me, and I want to introduce Josh, who is the director of the Urbit Foundation. He has agreed to speak with us today, which is very, very nice of him, especially since we are running a little late due to my technical mishaps at the beginning. So, Josh, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Yep.
Okay. Cool. Well, right on.
Do you want to share your presentation? Otherwise, I have it as a PDF over here on my end.
I just, I'll go ahead and share it because I'm going to flick through a bunch of slides and stuff. So first, thanks all of you for having me. I hope to leave you very intrigued by Urbit by the end of this and full of questions. So I'm going to try and, Justin provided a really good intro to the problems that we're facing right now and the reasons that we have set out to build Urbit in the first place. What I want to try and go over right now is a bit of how we got to this point, the computing history and the the way our technology is currently architected and has been, that has led us to a point where the internet is why it is today. And then go over a little bit about what Urbit is at a high level. And then hopefully we can have some time for Q&A afterwards and explore some of these ideas around incentives that Justin posed. So let me try and share my screen. All right, I think that's coming through. So I'll go ahead and get started. All right, so let's do a brief and I'll mention highly selective history lesson. So in the beginning, we had these things called mainframes. You may have heard of them. I have. I've only seen them in museums. It was like an entire room full of computer in order to power something that we all now know is less powerful than the phones we walk around with. And often many people would be here operating these computers all in this room or in some large building. And then there was this thing called the personal computer revolution. Happened in throughout the 80s into the 90s. I think there was a TV show made about this called Halt and Catch Fire. It was a revolution, big deal. And now, that revolution totally happened, right? We have all these personal computers and they do all this computing in the cloud, which looks like this. It's like totally personal. So, you might note the resemblance, like what happened? Well, it didn't. The personal computer revolution didn't really happen. Maybe it did briefly there back in the days of Windows 95 and installing software from boxes that we bought at Costco. But otherwise, we're kind of back in the boat that we used to be. We're back using these mainframes, but now they're way bigger, right? They're not like in a building, they're throughout the entire world. And our operating systems, they still have this characteristic sort of left over from the days of old, where you have this laptop, which is yours, yet you can have all these different users on it, as though that's something that people really do that much of anymore. And this is because, Mac OS, what we're looking at the login screen to here, and Windows and Linux, the main operating systems we use, were all designed based on this system called Unix, which had multiple users because Unix used to run on mainframes, where you had multiple users of a single computing system that was running in one place. So, originally, operating systems, they were multi-tenant, multiple people using them because of mainframes. And computers, they weren't really designed for individual people to use. They were designed for a specific location. And so this whole personal computer revolution thing, it was really more of a hardware revolution. It meant that we now all had computers in our homes and eventually our pockets and sometimes our wrists or whatever. But the software, it didn't actually change much. The devices, they became personal, but our software, it didn't really become personal. Now, also, along, about this time that this was going on, the internet sort of hit the scene, and people were very skeptical of that for a while. It took about the 90s, this period of about 10 years before this thing really started taking off, and then it crashed in the 2000s famously. But this was happening along the same time as people were switching to personal computing devices. And it turns out that the killer app for computers was it was the internet. It was communication between people and the ability to share information all over the place. It's important to note that this is not what computers were designed for. No one saw this coming. This kind of got bolted on to an existing foundation, which was not originally meant to handle networks as we know them, which is a theme we're going to return to. So yeah, this shift, it happened organically. It evolved, you might say. And so we built this on top of what we had, because that tends to be, how infrastructure goes. We just keep building on top of stuff. And that worked for a while, until it doesn't. I don't know if you've seen this guy, but this is the Linux mascot. This represents an operating system that you may not know is what powers 90% of all of our cloud infrastructure. It's also something like 74% of all of our mobile devices. Every Android phone is actually just running Linux under the hood. Very few personal computers actually use Linux. They use Mac OS, or they use Windows, or they use iOS, or they actually use Linux, but you don't know it, and they use this thing called Android. Linux is open source. It was developed in the early 90s. It was based on this thing called Unix. And today, 2009, a while after that, about 18 years, the creator of Linux, Linus Torvalds, he calls it bloated and huge. To be precise, Linux is about 20 million lines of code as of, I think, 2015 or 2016. And that's like the smallest part of it, the core, the kernel it's called. It's grown immensely, as has most software, like Facebook, which is something, I don't know exactly how big it is, but people say it's about 100 million lines of code, very large. So our cloud infrastructure, which is to say our internet, it's built on this really, really big, bloated, complicated stack. When you've got hundreds of millions or even tens of millions of lines of code, you can be pretty certain that there aren't very many people that understand how that whole thing works. And you can also be pretty certain that no one stands a chance at ever figuring out how that thing works, because that's just too many concepts for mere mortals to hold in their head. Which also means it's way too difficult for regular people to use. Like, Linux is open source. You can totally run your own Linux machine and your own server. You can run open source software on it. You can run your own mail server, like pretty much no one does. And the reason that people don't do this, like even system administrators, people that are professionals, they barely do this for their own use because it's so complicated. It's so hard to do. It requires a specialist, and it requires specialists more so as time is progressing. It's becoming harder and harder and harder. And as I mentioned before, Linux, which is a take on Unix, the creator of Linux, Linus, mashed his name together in with Unix. This whole thing, the core of it is based on Unix, which came out in 1971. Something like, not quite, but pretty close to 20 years before the internet actually became a thing. So all of our modern infrastructure is built on this technology that predates the dominant use case for it. And that's, I think, a bit of a problem, and might be at the root of why we are finding that there are so many problems with the software that we're building on top of the internet. So what would happen if we were to, say, like, rebuild the entire computing experience, the whole computer, rebuild the whole thing, around the idea of networks of individuals that talk directly to each other, which is how you think that the internet is supposed to work, right? We're all on the internet, we're all talking to each other. Except, as Justin pointed out, not really. That's like not how it's worked. We're sort of hacking it together to make it seem that way. And along the way, there's a bunch of other weird stuff that has happened in order to, to make this all work for everybody. The problem is rebuilding the entire computing experience. That would be a lot of work. But that's what Urbit is. It's an attempt, a successful attempt, to actually rebuild everything from the ground up, going all the way down to assembly language, reinventing that, a new language on top of it, a new operating system, a new network, and then a new software stack, all on top of a totally new foundation. Now, this is, I bolded these words, carefully designed, to contrast with the way that something like Linux came about. Linux was not carefully designed. It was hacked together by one dude. And then it evolved organically over decades, which is actually pretty cool. The open source movement is pretty cool. But Linux was built around something that actually was carefully designed, which is Unix. And so you might draw the same comparison between the software and different systems that are being built on top of Urbit and Linux that was built on top of Unix. Right? So there's these two sort of competing approaches to building software. You can have this very careful, principled approach to building something, which is often slow. It takes a while, versus, but a little bit more precise. Or you can have the sort of jumbled mess, but prolific and wildly organic approach that happens with open source. So Urbit has started this way, being sort of carefully designed, with some principles in mind. One is peer-to-peer communication, which means when I send you a message, I send you a message. I don't send it to somebody else and then they send it on to you, because, well, we can do that. But we can actually do it pretty well these days. Another principle here is that the architecture needs to be simple. Currently, Urbit is less than 50,000 lines of code, which you can contrast with Linux is about 20 million plus. It's tiny. And if your architecture is simple, normal people can actually stand a chance at understanding what the heck it does. When there's less code, you tend to have fewer bugs, tend to have fewer security vulnerabilities. It tends to be a lot easier to reason about because you don't have to hold millions of lines of code in your head. Another big one is the primacy of identity. This is what can actually make Urbit give you a real personal computer in the software sense. Right? Identity is a primitive built into the operating system and built into the way in which we do computing. And then ownership, the idea that you can own that identity, you can own your computer, you can own the data within it. And that's kind of what owning your computer means. You own the data and you own the identity. And this idea of ownership and the ability to really own something without having to rely on some trusted third party, like a bank or a social media company or a government, is relatively new. And we really started seeing a lot of development in this space, starting with Bitcoin, when blockchains hit the scene, provided a way for people to own things trustlessly without having to trust someone else with the ownership and the guarantee that says you own that thing that I say you do because I'm an authority and I can say so. This circumvents that. And so we've baked in some of the same principles to Urbit. So getting into what Urbit actually is, you can sort of conceptualize it as two things, two big components. There's Urbit OS and there's Urbit ID. So Urbit OS, we've stylized as these sort of layers here. OS stands for operating system. This is our completely new operating system that is designed to be owned and operated by one person for their entire life, their whole life, and ideally then handed on to their children. It should become like a family heirloom. It's not code that you write and throw away to be replaced with the next version of Windows or whatever. It's meant to last. But that means that our design decisions, they really matter, and they're very different than those that went into other computers. And building Urbit, we occupy a somewhat privileged position because we can look back at the history of computer development and kind of pick and choose from which things ended up working and which things didn't. So here's some of the things we think about when building a new operating system. Like, it needs to be simple and low maintenance. If you're going to be a regular person that can actually operate, run, and use this thing without some sort of specialized knowledge, you shouldn't have to go to school to learn how to use your computer. It should just be something that's fairly simple to use. You run it and then it just runs. it should be good at talking to other computers, because turns out that's basically what we use computers for these days. We want to get information from other people that have it. That's called a web page. We want to send a message. We want to do a video call. These are all forms of talking to other people via computers. It seems to be, in my mind and in our mind over at Urbit, the killer thing that we do with computers. Not exclusively. We also like send rockets to the moon and stuff. That's a different set of requirements and probably needs a different computer. But for most of us, we're not going to the moon on rockets or Mars. We're mostly just talking to people and staying in touch in all of those different forms. It also needs to stay fairly hardware agnostic. Hardware keeps changing. So Urbit isn't a new computer in the sense of like a new physical box. It's a software layer. And it can map to hardware. There are ways to implement it on many different kinds of hardware, and it's hardware agnostic. But this is a solution that's specifically addressed at the software level. And then finally, it needs to last a long time, because people last a long time. This shouldn't be something that you have to replace every few years. Okay, and then there's this other part called Urbit ID. Urbit ID is kind of cool. It's got pictures. Here's an example of what I mean about ID and ownership, just to hit this point home a little more. Here's a bunch of my IDs. I've got an email that is, of course, provided by, here's all my IDs. You see the parentheses on the right, where they come from. These are the people that actually own those IDs. Some of these are real identities. You can reach out to me on Twitter if you want. I've taken care to hide my social security number. But that's an identifying piece of information that we think of as like, oh, it's very important. It really identifies me, but I still don't own it. The U.S. government does. That's their way of, of keeping an ID on me. Now there are other kinds of IDs that I actually own because of cryptography. Urbit uses the same mechanism that Bitcoin and Ethereum do. In fact, Urbit ID is built on top of Ethereum. And this provides this ability for you to actually own your ID without any need for a trusted authority. No government, no Bird app, no Google, no GitHub, no Verizon Wireless owning your phone number. You can own an Urbit ID more completely than you can really even own your name, because you can memorize the private key for it that verifies your ownership to the rest of the world. And this is that primary breakthrough of blockchains and cryptography. So having something like Urbit ID, it represents sort of a fundamental shift in the way we think about using our computer. Our ID isn't just something that you create in the computer after you've installed the operating system. You don't have the computer and then create your user account in it and then create, a bajillion more in every web service you use. The identity is part of the computer, and if the computer does not work, the Urbit computer does not work without an identity that exists. And that's because on this network, every single actor, every single computer has to have an identity, and only one. Now, another final point about this is that the Urbit IDs, they're limited and scarce. There's roughly 4.3 billion of them, or 2 to the 32, which is, one, you may know, less than the number of people that are on Earth. That makes it scarce, right? Not everyone on Earth can have one. Now, there aren't 4.3 billion people that are currently on today's internet, and today's internet has been around for a long time. So there's a long, long time before we get to a place where that 4.3 billion limit is that significant. And it can be changed, but the idea is that having an ID should be valuable. We've already seen what not having a limited, like having a valuable ID is. If you've ever gotten email spam, or ever gotten trolled on Twitter or Reddit or trolled in any way, anywhere on the internet? Well, that's what having cheap identity brings you. It brings you spam because well, anyone can engage with what's called a Sybil attack. They can just spawn a bajillion identities and spam with those because there's zero cost to them because there's an infinite number of them. That is not how people conduct themselves in real life. More on that later. So what is an Urbit ID? Well, it's a number of things, but two of the more important ones are at least forms that it takes look like this. There's a speakable form of it. Actually, Urbit ID is just a number, but from that number we can derive either this name here, Woolref Podlex, which is an algorithmic representation of the number that is my Urbit ID. And it's speakable because every single one of them goes consonant, vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel, consonant, and so on. So you can pronounce it. And it looks like nonsense, but turns out the human brain is pretty good at mapping IDs to things or speakable names to things over time. And it should also be recognizable, which the name is, but there's also this sort of cool thing, which is called a sigil, which is another algorithmic representation of that number, but as an image. And people do all kinds of cool things with these. They look kind of cool, and you can eventually recognize people by this sigil. So together, UrbitOS and Urbit ID are better than the sum of either of their parts. There hasn't really been anything quite like UrbitOS that has been created to my knowledge. Urbit ID, on the other hand, there are people trying to create decentralized identity systems. Like what Urbit ID is, but on Ethereum, but without all the Urbit stuff. The problem they have is that when you're not part of an environment, an underlying computing platform that recognizes that ID and enforces it throughout the entire system, and makes it actually a part of the networking layer, it just doesn't have the same punch. So a couple of properties of this, like having an ownable scarce identity as a primitive within a computer actually models human interaction because your reputation matters. What you do and say is remembered by other people. If you start trolling people with your Urbit ID, then they don't like you anymore and they ban you and you stop being able to talk to other people because no one will talk to you because you're a jerk. Well, now you got to buy a new Urbit ID, and it actually costs money. Urbit IDs used to cost about $20. Last I checked yesterday, they now will cost, I think, about $150. It's not feasible to be a jerk with an Urbit ID and then have to keep buying more of these every time people get tired of your antics. So that's actually how things work with normal people. If you walk around being a complete jerk to everyone, they stop talking to you and you stop having friends and stop getting invited to parties, and that's no fun. So there's a social order that enforces that you act well with your other human beings because they will remember you. They remember what your face looks like and they remember your name. Well, that stuff sticks. That's not so on Twitter. Okay, another point. A network that's owned by the people using it provides this natural facility for quality control. Because individuals perform their own content moderation, they want the quality of the network and the people they engage with to be high because they own a part of it. And this goes back to what Justin was mentioning from Tyler Cowen's article early on, which is that when people own things, they tend to take care of them. Right? It's that way with a house, one that you own versus one that you rent. You want your house to be nice because ultimately, you have value there, you have equity in it, and you want that to be high. You want things to look good and be well taken care of, or else your property is destroyed. Well, it's the same thing with the network. Now, content moderation. This is kind of an important one. Content moderation has been sort of a hot button topic for probably about the last year. Who makes sure that the content is good? In normal life, the way that you make sure that your content is good and the way that censorship works is I don't talk to people that I don't like, and they don't talk to me. I moderate my own content by seeking out those people that I want to hear from and just not contacting the ones I don't. We perform self-censorship all the time. What we have on today's internet is third-party censorship. We have these gatekeepers that decide what you see and what you don't. And, that's a whole other discussion. So here, that content moderation is performed by individuals. Every person decides who they want to engage with and who they don't. Data is another one. Right? When you use an Urbit, you're putting data on your own computer, your own server. And when you want to send a message to someone else or share information with someone else, you share your data with that person. This is exactly how it works with individuals having a conversation. What I'm saying right now, you are free to remember. All the information leaving my mouth is going into your brain. You're going to remember it. You now own that memory. And I have no say whether or not you get to keep it or not. This has come up in law recently, in the last few years, with the European right to be forgotten. And the idea that providers of web services, if they are asked to remove information that someone has put into them, they are liable to ensure that that information is removed from around the internet. Not only is that impossible for a company to actually do, because people can just download stuff and put it on their computer, keep it offline, it just doesn't make sense because that isn't how the world works. What does happen on Urbit, though, is that I choose who I share my information with. And privacy is the default. I'm always running my own software and choosing who I share my own software with. It's not some extra feature, something you pay extra for, something that you get if you contact the right person with know-how or use the best service or whatever. That's just how things work by default. Kind of like, with your brain. You think, and it's private by default unless you choose to open your mouth and share it. So Urbit, it's basically better digital infrastructure. We hope that with it we can build a better digital world, something that looks a lot different than the one we have right now. It's still very young. It's really, we're using the very first product that has ever been built on it now, and we have been using that for the last year. And so we're starting to see these patterns emerge, but time will tell. So anyway, that's what I got. If you have some questions, happy to answer them.
Well, thanks, Josh. That was, of course, as I promised, much better than what I had to say. So, does anyone have any questions for Josh? I had a couple. Yeah, Isaac.
I might have missed it, but what would the cost of the, so it's like you pay for your own, what is the cost of it?
The question is, what is the cost of Urbit? Because, like Josh said, you pay for your own, so you buy an Urbit identity.
Yeah. So what's the cost? Well, yeah, you buy an Urbit. You buy it from another person. Urbit address space is distributed in chunks. What we were talking about, what I have is called a planet. I get my planet from a star. Stars and planets. So once I buy one, it's a one-time cost, and I own it. Now I own it forever. And if I lose it, well, it's gone forever. No one can reset it, the password for me if I forget it. So what does it cost to run ongoing? That depends. Right now, one option is you can pay Tlon, the company that has built Urbit, a monthly fee to host your Urbit for you. That's the easiest way to get going if you're not technical, but it sort of sucks because you don't want to pay a monthly fee if you can avoid it. I'm currently running my Urbit on my laptop, so if you have a computer, you can just run it right on your computer. that just means your computer sort of needs to be on all the time because it's a server and it's supposed to be there for people to contact you. You can run it yourself in some cloud hosting provider like DigitalOcean or Google or Amazon, but that's sort of a bummer because we're kind of trying to get out of that world in the first place. You can also run it on your own home server, and there's a very active group of people that are running Urbits on Raspberry Pis as little home servers in their house. And so, we would like to have a world in which you can also buy a physical computer to run an Urbit on that's kind of optimized for that, and it just kind of runs in your closet or whatever. So there's a scale, is the real answer. You can run it like a normal server. You can run it, which means locally on hardware you bought, or in a cloud context, so it's always on and someone else manages for you. So the cost varies.
I would say also an answer to that question. So you purchase an identity originally, and then there are 4 different options. Those were what Josh was outlining for how to continually run it. If you're just running it on your own laptop, that's free for you, right? Because you're just paying for the power to do that. I run my Urbit on my laptop as well. Finally, I would say that Josh mentioned in the talk, planets usually go for between around $20, or recently they've been around $150. But I will make a personal guarantee to you that if you come to all 3 of our Urbit meetings, I will make sure to get you a planet. So I am personally committed to getting you an Urbit identity, and then you can either use one of those 4 methods to run your Urbit after I give it to you. It might take even a month after the last meeting, but I'm committed to getting each and every one of you an Urbit identity.
So nothing, costs you nothing.
There you go. Any further questions? JC?
I do. Where can you obtain an Urbit account if you're not getting a computer? So I want to get more. Could I just buy them up, collect the food, and resell them? Or
so JC's question is, where else aside from me can people buy Urbit identities? And could you buy a bunch, bundle them, and resell them?
You can. I mean, they come by default. They come bundled in stars, and you can buy a star today, and one star has about 64,535 planets in it, 2 to the 16. So you get a lot of planets with 1 star, and right now 1 star goes for last I checked, $6,200. Now, of course, these are all traded over the counter right now. So if you know someone with one, that's who you're buying it from. There are a couple of sites that list them, but the majority of sales are still done, over the counter. Now, the price of a star is heavily discounted because if you did the math and you figure, take a low estimate of the value of a planet, given that they range between $20 and $150, 20 times 65,000 is about $1.3 million. So the reason for that discount is that, there's just not enough demand for 65,000 planets from you yet. So there is a market for these. And that's one of the big parts. You can think about it like real estate. We often say that if Bitcoin is digital currency, Urbit is digital land. And if you know anything about real estate, land is usually a good thing to own.
Russ, did you have a question?
Yeah, let's see. It was related to what you guys were talking about before. I can't remember exactly what that one was, but my other question was, does encryption help address today's encryption as we know it, help address the privacy issue close to what Urbit does, or is it really a lot different because you still got that intermediary? I get that, but these encryption services, is that close to Urbit in terms of privacy?
Can you specify which encryption services?
No, I don't even know myself because I don't use them for the most part. I just know.
You probably mean end-to-end encryption on things like WhatsApp or Signal.
Yes.
Yeah. They help for sure. And what it the way that works is, Signal is running the Signal service somewhere up in the cloud, and it's still the case that when you send a message to someone else over Signal, it goes to Signal and then down to the other person. The difference is that you encrypt it on your end with a key that Signal doesn't know, so they can't decrypt it. So you do get your privacy because they, at least if you trust them that they can't decrypt it, because that's what you have to do, then you actually are private. Your conversations are private and know they can't read them. Now, if Signal goes down, it doesn't really matter because you can't send your messages to anybody. So now they're extra private. But that's kind of the root of the problem. A, you have to trust them that it is actually end-to-end encrypted. And there are legislative attempts to install backdoors to end-to-end encryption for terrorism prevention and all that stuff, as usual. Which it's like, okay, well, that's the problem. There's a centralized actor, Signal, that can be attacked or legislated against so that it sort of breaks the whole thing. So yes, but is the answer, and the buts are significant.
And this might be a dumb question, but if your server goes down, so say for instance you said the best way of running it is kind of always having the server up and running. If it goes down, is it done, like dead, or can it come back up? It's just technically offline at the moment.
Like the laptop died.
Oh yeah, it'll come back online.
Okay.
And Urbit's kind of neat too, because you can actually take your whole server down and you can package it all up into what's called a tarball. It's a zip file. Basically puts it all in one compressed file. You can move it to a different computer. You can boot it right back up, and it picks up right where it left off.
So it doesn't have to be just on one computer. You can move it around to multiple computers if you want.
That's right. So a common thing you can do is you can run it on your laptop, and then someday you want to upgrade to some always-on computer that's in the cloud, or you want to move it onto a always-on dedicated piece of hardware. You just package the thing up, move it to the other computer, turn it back on, and it's good to go.
Oh, wow.
If you had been typing keys at the terminal and turned it off mid-type, they'll still be there when you boot it back on. It remembers everything. So that's another thing about Urbit. You can't turn it off and turn it back on to troubleshoot it because it doesn't work that way. It just keeps working.
I got one that's kind of related to that. When somebody tries to communicate you, if your server's down, does it sit in a holding like an email would, or does it actually say, sorry, we're not home? Because I'm trying to get this connection between face-to-face communication. I knock on Justin's door, Justin's not home, I have to go away. Does it work that way, like similar to email, that once you go back online, then the message will transmit?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
To an extent, because it's basically, if you try and send something to me and my ship is down because I shut my laptop lid by accident or something, your ship, and ship is the name we use to refer to a running Urbit, your ship will just keep it in a queue and keep trying to contact me for some period of time and until I come back online. And you can manually clear that queue if you want. I don't actually know how long it keeps trying for before it automatically clears itself out, but I do believe it works for multiple days. I've had my ship go down and I turn it back on, and then all of a sudden I get a bunch of messages from a bunch of people that were trying to contact me while I was offline.
Whilst you're on Urbit, you can contact anyone else who does not have Urbit. So let's say you're on your email, you have Urbit, but they don't. You still receive their messages. It's just that someone trying to hack it or see it will not know your identity, but they'll still know the other person's.
Well, all of the communication happens over Urbit. So if they don't have one, there isn't any way to communicate with them through Urbit. Right? It's a whole separate network.
So they have to have Urbit too.
They have to have an Urbit. That's right.
Let's just say in 20 years, this becomes the next big thing. A bunch of people have Urbit, and it's a very extreme scenario. But let's just say you're in court and now they're trying to get access to your Urbit. is there any way that legislation do you see in a couple of years where you will give access or extreme circumstances where you will give access to somebody else's Urbit?
See if I understand. You're asking if, if you're like in a setting where some government authority is mandating, or some authority is mandating access to your Urbit, can they get it?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So
Waterboarding.
So access to your Urbit is like there's two different things that someone could have access to. There's one, the physical computer, right, and the information in it, which is eventually encrypted with your keys. Right now, it's encrypted in transit, but not at rest, because the devs haven't gotten around to it yet. Assuming it actually is encrypted at rest, meaning when it's sitting there on disk, it cannot be read because it's encrypted with your actual keys, which it will be. Assuming they've basically got possession of the actual data in your computer. They've maybe you hosted this in the Google Cloud and they contacted Google and said, can you give me, all the contents of this computer that is running Urbit, and they get all those contents and they're encrypted with your key. Can they get access to that information? Only if they have your private key. So that depends on how you store your private key. And there's many ways to do this. And this is a very hot topic because, and more notably in, say, the Bitcoin community, you've probably heard stories about people that, bought a bunch of Bitcoins back in 2013 and, now they've got like $600 million in Bitcoin because the price went up so much, but they can't remember how to get into the wallet. They lost their private key. And so if you lose the private key, or if someone cannot access the private key, then no, there's no way to get the information. Gone forever. And no one can get it back. So depending on how you store that private key, and it is possible to just memorize it. It's not that hard. It's, my name is Wolref Podlex.
And what's your key?
That's my name. My key is different. My key is twice that length, but it's the same format. So I could easily memorize it. In fact, I have memorized it. So if someone wanted access to that, then could they get it? Well, if they torture me, sure. At some point I would probably crack. It depends on the value that's locked up in that key. But that's the idea. It's that the degree of security you can have on this is synonymous with your person. And so at some point, there is always a way to coerce someone, but that coercion becomes so oppressive that, it's, that's a whole different thing to deal with if you get to that point. So if you have shoddy security, then, if you just like store your key laying around on a Post-it note on your desktop, then yeah, sure, it's a lot easier to crack. But the point is you actually have the ability to be in complete control of it such that no one could get access to it unless they resorted to some form of physical coercion.
So a question for further clarification on that. There's no company called Urbit out there that has your information. Is that correct?
No, there is no company called Urbit. Urbit is an open source project. There is a company called Tlon that is actually working on building Urbit, but they don't have the information. Any Urbit ID you get, once you get the keys to it, they're yours. No one else has them. Which is why if you lose them, which we've had emails in our support inbox today of someone who bought a star back in 2017 and lost the keys. It's like, sorry, man. Sucks. Don't lose them.
Quick one related to that. So does the simplicity of the code increase our confidence that it's private because it's verifiable by other people who know coding? Is that why that's an important feature of it, that the code was simple with 50,000 lines or whatever it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it also increases our confidence that there aren't security vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And that's why we have all of these famous hacks is because, somewhere buried in hundreds of millions of lines of code, there was a vulnerability. There's probably more of them that haven't been found yet, or at least that we don't know haven't been found yet. So, yeah.
Hey, I forgot what it was. Stars. So say someone owns a star
Mhm.
without the planets, but then they lose their key to their star. Does it wipe those people's planets that they own? Does that make sense?
No. I mean, it makes sense, but no, if you own a star and you have all these planets that are what are called unspawned, and you spawn them and you give them to someone, once you give it to that person, you don't have it anymore. The star owner, they get it. You have zero control. What a star does do is it provides, stars also run on the network, and they're what are called infrastructure nodes, and they perform basically network services to the rest of the network. So one of the things a star will do is peer discovery. If I'm trying to talk to you, I have to figure out first where in the world you are and how to send packets over a network to you. And if I've never talked to you before, I have no clue where you are. So I have to ask a star if it knows how to get in touch with you. And if it does, it knows the path that your ship is to, it'll basically tell me where you are so I can now talk to you. So it's possible that the star is down. Like if someone gives me a planet, or if I give you a planet and I'm not running my star, you can't talk to anyone. But you can leave me and you can go to any other star on the network freely. And then you can use them. So, yeah.
Any other questions? I have a further one, Josh.
Yeah.
You guys probably don't know, but Josh has actually started, I think, multiple companies before running the Urbit Foundation. So I was wondering if you could say anything about your experience at those previous companies and maybe how a world in which Urbit is adopted improves the experience of maybe operating a company, or maybe some kind of work that companies have to do today that just gets obviated in a world where Urbit exists.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of ways I could take this. I first started as a programmer building software, and building software these days is very complicated and getting more and more complicated, not easier, as many would have you believe. There are things that are getting easier about it, but still at the core, the whole thing is getting more complicated. So, one thing that would have been nice is be a little less code to write, a little less to build. Now, another whole area, and probably the more interesting thing for this conversation is, I started 3 companies. The first 2 ran out of money and died. The third one didn't, did quite well. He's still doing quite well, at least I think. I worked on that for about 4.5 years, and that's a company that builds co-living buildings, so communal housing. And I was building technology there. And a big part of building technology, or building any business that involves software these days, is managing people's data. You end up collecting all kinds of information from people that they give you as the normal course of using this. And if you're a landlord, basically like we were, some of that information is very sensitive. And so you need to protect it. Every business that builds any software that stores any data about anyone, which is right now every software business or every software adjacent business, has to protect that information, because if it gets leaked, it looks really bad. It's their fault. It can have major legal repercussions. There's now a whole class of people that are essentially digital ambulance chasers that will try to exploit GDPR rules by signing up to online services and then demanding a GDPR data takedown. with threat of legal action if they can continue to verify that that data has not yet been taken down. And sometimes, like, the process of purging someone's data from your system, like, usually that's not the first thing that you think of to build when you build software, is how to eject all the information you might have about someone safely. Well, now it needs to be, because you are threatened legal action if you don't do that. And it doesn't matter that that request can be fundamentally absurd, because you could be storing documents and all of your employees could download those documents onto their computers and you have no way of finding that out. So anyway, there's a huge class of things that a company that builds software on behalf of other people has to do, which is maintain data on behalf of people, whether or not they actually are using that data for anything nefarious or not, or for monetizing. They just need it in order to run software on behalf of other people, because SaaS is the way, or software as a service is the way that you build software these days. If it's going to be accessed through an app or through a browser or in any modern networked capacity. And so, yeah, there's a huge amount of cost that goes into security and database administration, and then the infrastructure management to make sure that you've got your software up and running for people all the time. In an Urbit world, all of the people using my software just run it themselves, and they store their own data, and their security is their own problem. It comes back to their keys. And so I, as a person building software in a business context, focus on building my software and distributing it to people, not on managing the data and ensuring that all of it is secure for everybody, because security breaches are either everyone's data is stolen or you're secure, which sucks. I don't have to make sure that all of my servers are online all the time for everyone, for all however many hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of users I have, because each of them are now responsible for running their own server. And if they go down, it doesn't affect everybody else. So for business, at least for a business that doesn't profit off of data mining or creepiness, it's good. If you're building a business that is a data mining business, well, Urbit's maybe not for you. Yeah, probably wouldn't work too well.
Isaac has one more question.
Yeah, sorry. So I know Urbit is, like, the point of it is an OS for like a computer, but is there goals of maybe Urbit being something that, as well as like a cell phone kind of thing? So for like a OS for like a smartphone kind of thing, or not really?
Could be. It could be the software layer for one of those. And so, I didn't go fully into the Urbit ID hierarchy, but a ship is a running Urbit, and there's 5 different kinds of ships. We talked about the planet, that's what represents a person, and the star, which is an infrastructure node that can spawn planets. There's one above stars that I don't need to get into for the sake of this, but there's one below the planet, which is called moon. If I'm running a planet, I can create 4.3 billion moons. These are basically shards of my identity. And they're individual running Urbit operating systems that can talk back to me, the mothership. Right? So you can imagine a world in which I've got a cell phone, and I got my Urbit that's running always on, up in the cloud or over there in the corner of my room for some reason. Well, my phone could run a moon. And so this would be an identity that I provision from my planet. So I maintain some control over it, and I have the ability to spawn new ones at will. I'm going to destroy this one because I got 4.3 billion of them, so they're kind of cheap. But that's the idea, is that I could have, this moons could actually run on a variety of different devices. They could be phones, they could be IoT devices, they could be watches, they could be, I don't know, any network device. But yes, you could do that. There's a lot of, it's possible. There's a long road ahead because, building phones is kind of hard. Building hardware is kind of hard. that's why there's like basically, there's Apple and then there's all the knockoffs that do it. There are things like PinePhone, if you haven't heard of that, which is like an open, an open hardware stack for a new kind of cell phone, which we actually have some people experimenting with running Urbit moons on that, and then controlling it. So anyway, long answer is there's a way to do it. It's probably a few years out. By a few, I mean like 10.
All right. We are coming up on time here. I would like, we should all give Josh a round of applause. So we are going to meet next week here. We have another speaker, and I will talk even less next week, so it will be even better. We have somebody who is writing a novel on Urbit right now, so they're composing it on Urbit. And the novel is about actually the development of Urbit historically and the ways in which decisions made in the past kind of affect our computing environment today, and the dystopia or utopia that we could have going forward. So I look forward to seeing all of you next week, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Is there any way we can contact